Okay, so I've been away for like 2 months doing research at Purdue, and I figured this is one of the uh, presentations that I gave on my research to the group. So I'll just upload it. Might as well, right? And so what I was working on was laser frequency stabilization for the purpose of trapping atoms on a microring resonator, which is a brutal title. And so I'm going to just break it down into these three parts here. And first, we can start with what microrings are. And kind of unsurprisingly, it's a micro ring. But really, it's essentially a circuit that consists of two parts. Uh, you have this bus waveguide, and both of these are waveguides, right? And waveguides are just something that you send light across. It's like a fiber optic cable, for example. That's a waveguide, right? So there's this bus waveguide here, which carries the light, and then there's this micro ring, which is another waveguide. And essentially, the goal here is to get resonance inside. And so light will follow this, but it has a sort of curve of intensity, like it's most intense through this waveguide, and then it sort of tapers off as the photons come off of it. It's like sort of it's just basic refraction, really. And so essentially, to achieve resonance inside of here, you have to consider this index of refraction of the photons falling off of the bus and into the microring. Uh, I tried to talk to the person on our team who makes these about like how they made it, but they didn't really reply to me. So my only understanding is that it's sort of made in slices and then hardened afterwards, but I can't give much beyond that. So the next part is traps and really trapping atoms, and so that has to do with, at least in our experiment, it has to do with these things called magic wavelengths, which has to do with different transitions. So a laser, right? We're using a bunch of lasers to trap these atoms, and lasers have different frequencies, which is sort of what this project's about. So they have different frequencies, and depending on their frequency, they do different things, right? They interact with particles differently. And so these magic wavelengths are essentially specific transitions of different atoms that will have the same frequency anyway. And so what we're using for this project is this 935 red detuned and 795 blue detuned, which what detuned means is okay, so light, especially for lasers, right? We can control a bunch of different factors about them. And so you can sort of thermally regulate the laser, and you can regulate whatever current you're sending through the piezo. And piezos are these little mirrors on a motor, technically. They're these little mirrors on a motor that you can use, and they'll wiggle the wavelength of the laser by like 0.01, depending on whatever you give them. And so you can use those two factors to control these lasers and move their resonant frequency off of where it naturally is. And so in this case, our red detuned laser is attractive to the particles, and the blue detuned laser is repulsive. And so using that, we can make a two-color evanescent field trap. And there's two kinds. The first is a bulk trap, right here, as you can see, in which only one of the lasers needs to go into the microring, and the other one we can just illuminate differently. And because when these two lasers combine, they just trap atoms there. So we can load atoms onto the trap, and it's held about 300 nanometers above the microring. The other more interesting version, what I was trying to make, is this sort of individual trap, where if both of the lasers can resonate inside of this ring, then they end up interfering with each other and creating these potentials along the ring as they resonate, because resonance is like a standing wave. How do I describe a standing wave to someone who isn't experienced in physics? It's like, okay, so you have a jump rope, right? And it has this shape. And every time the jump rope goes around, it keeps this shape. It doesn't fluctuate. And so that's essentially a harmonic, right? And a standing wave has different harmonics, right? You have your first harmonic, then you have your second harmonic, and then you have your third harmonic. And basically, it's just a wave that interferes with itself in a way that it doesn't move. And so because these lasers will interfere with each other, you get these potentials, and in each of these potentials, you can trap an atom. Okay, and so the frequency stabilization, which is necessary for the lasers to resonate with the microring, because it's not super easy to do. So there are a couple parts to this setup, and this here is a scanning cavity, which an optical cavity, is just another word would be like an aileron or an interferometer. It's basically just two mirrors in which light bounces inside and then comes out, right? This specifically, it's a little bit curved, and then light reflects a handful of times through here in this like cross pattern type thing. But what a scanning cavity is specifically is, depending on the voltage you give it, it'll change the length of the cavity itself. And this is important because these standing waves can only resonate, or light can only resonate when it can hit a standing wave, and the standing wave depends on the wavelength of the light and the length of the cavity, which this equation, this is for this circular resonance. It's not for just a regular cavity, but that's sort of the idea. And so all of the lasers are going through here, and there are 3 lasers, and then this mirror will bounce one of them this way and 2 of them this way, because this mirror will only let through, I think it's like over 800 nanometer light. And so we have the 795 laser going into here, and then we have the 852 and the 935 laser going into here. And both of these detectors are hooked up to this Arduino, and this Arduino is like the brain of the operation. And so, okay, so the Arduino, we're basing it off of this paper that we found that claims to stabilize these lasers. And so it goes through a couple of steps here. So first, it sends a trigger into the function generator, which is this thing down here. And so the function generator, it will send this signal into the scanning cavity. And this is the voltage on the y-axis here, and then time on the x-axis. And so this voltage, the scanning cavity will just get a little bit longer, and then it'll drop down again. And while it is getting a little bit longer, depending on the length, of course, these lasers will hit the resonances. And so we check for the peaks in the master. So the lasers are called, the 852 laser is called the master laser, and the other 2 are called slave lasers, because the master laser will resonate with the cavity naturally. And then, well, not naturally, but basically we know that the master laser will resonate with the cavity. The slave lasers do not resonate. They need to be detuned, which is what I mentioned, which means that we need to kind of like wiggle their wavelength a little bit. And so the purpose of this laser frequency locking is so that we can tune the wavelength in real time so that it will continuously resonate. Like, it's pretty easy to get it to resonate for like, a couple seconds, but it'll fluctuate, and we don't want it to do that. Because, if it's fluctuating, then the trap can't hold anything, so there's no real point. Okay, so basically, it checks for a peak in the master signal, which is here, and then it'll check for a peak in the slave signal, which is here. Now, there would be another peak here, which would be the 935 laser. This one is out of commission, so just kind of ignore it. So essentially, it finds this peak, then it finds this peak, and then it finds this peak. And then using these, it'll find error signals, which are sort of, what it checks is the proportion of time between the master to master and the master to slave. And then it'll take the ratio of those, and it'll compare it to a ratio that's set in the code. Yeah, and so it compares it to what's set in the code. And then using the error, that's what it is, the error signal, it'll send a feedback to the piezos of the slave lasers to make an adjustment. And of course, the goal is for it to be 0. And it uses a PID feedback, which I didn't add into here because everyone kind of knew what a PID feedback was in the physics research program. But essentially, it's a sort of like error correcting thing. If you're trying, for example, like heating a house, for example, since heaters generally turn only on and off, so like if you want to control the temperature, it'll turn on and off at different ratios. But it'll check the temperature, and then it'll see, okay, well, we need to turn on a little bit longer. And so it'll turn on a little bit longer. And it checks the temperature again, and it's like, okay, well, we need to turn on a little bit less. And then so it'll sort of just fluctuate like that, it'll sort of bounce around until it equalizes. And I don't have a screen recording of this, but I did in a different presentation of just as I start the code running onto the Arduino, it sort of, the error stabilizes after a couple of seconds until it hits 0. And of course, after it hits 0, then the code will try and keep it as it is. And so regarding the frequency of the laser, so we want it to not move at all. Unfortunately, it does move. The slave laser, that is. The master lasers do not move, which is why we're using them to lock the frequency. And so what do we know about the frequency? Well, we're trying to essentially find out what this is, because this is time, right? This is the time axis, and from the time axis we can get the frequency. But it's worth knowing the calculation so that we can feed it back into the code. And so what information do we have? Well, first, we know the voltages at which these will resonate. And that's valuable because when it resonates, we have an equation for that. And so here, this is the resonance equation. And this lambda r is just the reference frequency, or the slave laser. Master laser. And so since we know that these voltages are proportional to whatever the length of the cavity is at the time, we can use that. And so what else do I know? Well, we know that the fluctuations in the length of the cavity are going to be the same whether or not we're talking about the slave laser or the master laser. And so that gives us this equation, which is pretty trivial. It's just saying that the difference in the length of the cavity is related to the difference in the voltage. And so another equation, and we can just, since we're essentially looking for the length fluctuations, because our end goal is to find the frequency fluctuations here, and the frequency is going to be the inverse, or technically not the inverse, but the frequency is going to be related to the wavelength. And so if we know the fluctuation in the length of the cavity where it resonates, then we can find the wavelength fluctuations, and then out of that, the frequency fluctuations. And so another equation we can find is this one, which is to say that the fluctuation of the cavity is directly related to the fluctuation of the wavelength, which is what I was saying here. Since the wavelength and the cavity are sort of constant, the fluctuations in them are directly related, because this is not, unlike this, which is two separate modes, which is to say, like, for example, this is the third harmonic, this is the fourth harmonic, so these are different resonances. This is the same resonance, and essentially the reason for that is because it's the wavelength that's fluctuating. And so from that, we can extract the fluctuations of the wavelength. And you'll notice that this term here is just this term. So we can combine that all into this one big equation. And you'll notice that this delta V and this delta L, well, we do know that, right? This delta L, I mean, it's pretty easy. You just take these. And since these are modes that are just right next to each other, the difference is just going to be the reference wavelength over 2. And so we can just put that into the equation and rearrange. And so the fluctuations in the wavelength are going to be the fluctuations in the voltage, which we can read. And then all of these are known values. So this wavelength, for example, since the 935 was dysfunctional, it's just going to be the 795 laser here. This reference wavelength is going to be the 852 laser, which we're using as the master laser. This 2, just a constant, whatever. This L is just going to be the length of the cavity, which the one we were using is 5 centimeters. And this distance in the voltage is just the difference between um, these two heights. And yeah, I mean, I'm gonna blur these names because I don't like. I mean, they don't know I'm uploading this, but these are just the research papers that I was referencing for this presentation. And yeah, that's kind of what I've been working on for 2 months. Basically, I'm messing around with the code to minimize whatever this fluctuation is in layman's terms. I'm just kind of trying to get it to wiggle less. Yeah.